So the question is, now what? And there are lots of different kind of models, frameworks, cycles that you can use to help you get unstuck. And I thought I would share a couple of them, and then we're going to practice with an after-action review tool that often helps people get unstuck. All right, so I think there are 4 F words that are really helpful for getting unstuck. Here are 4 of them that I thought of. Whoops. So one is fast. So we're going to keep coming back to this idea of trying to make the learning loop as fast as you possibly can. So the point about people getting fatigued earlier is a really important point, because we used to, when we first started introducing people to DataWise, they would take like a year to get organized. And we'd be like, that's good, take your time, you need a solid foundation. And then we were like, then you got to get to the other steps, and you can't take a year on each step because by then the kids have gone through 8 years of schooling, and you know. So we learned too that the faster people went, the more they learned and the better they got. So fast is important. Feedback is another thing that's really important, that you have to, this isn't just like we're giving feedback to people who are trying things, that's important, but what this means is you're using the act of trying things as feedback on how things are going. So you're learning from actually trying them, and that feedback is informing the next action step. And that's that concept of the arrow bending back on itself that we talked about with DataWise. Now, this next one is the one I think we're most allergic to in education, and it's fail. This is actually, I think we're so allergic to the concept of failure in education, which comes from the best of intentions. We don't want failure for our children. What happens though is our fear of failure, especially of our own failure, perpetuates the failures that we're already having with our kids. And we're failing the kids aren't failing, we're failing the kids. And so our fear of that failure, you know, ironically and sadly just perpetuates it. And so we have to create the culture and the processes that make failure at a small level okay, because failure is where learning requires failure most of the time. It requires making mistakes and trying something new. So failure is really important, but you have to make it not so high stakes that, one, it's a huge risk, you know, that we're gambling on children or something like that, but also that basically it makes it okay for the adults to risk trying something new. And then the last thing is forward, which is one of the words that surfaced. And the notion here is actually, whatever you're doing, it should be helping the next thing. So this is especially powerful with failure. So fail forward. You know, failure is not a big deal as long as you're failing forward and you're learning from whatever that failure is and you're applying it to the next thing. So as I share with you a couple of examples from out in the world of how people integrate these concepts, just notice that all 4 of these things are really inherent in different models for how you learn fast. So the first one is this notion of rapid learning cycles. It comes from the kind of innovation sector of business, and it comes from lean design and lean methodology. And the basic idea is that you're trying to make those learning cycles as quick and kind of sketchy dirty as you can. So you're not trying to make something perfect, but the idea is that if you have a really tight learning cycle, first of all, you minimize waste. So instead of, we've invested huge numbers of resources and time and energy by making this big bet on something that we're trying, it's like, let's try to test an idea out. And maybe we'll test 3 ideas out and we'll figure out which one of them is working best in our context. The other idea is that it maximizes efficiency. So you kind of counterintuitively can go faster by doing lots of little cycles than by one big cycle. And so this link that's on the bottom of the slide will take you to a little article by the leader of one of the companies that's really popularized rapid learning cycles out in the world. And she talks about how she gives a concrete example of basically we made a higher quality product faster by using rapid learning cycles of just prototyping different ideas and testing them out and feeding that back into the design, rather than having a huge investment in one big idea and seeing how it worked. The breaking big challenge into smaller parts is really important. So you may have a really big thing that you're trying to do, like we're trying to really, really change the kinds of readers and writers our kids are, or problem solvers or something like that. But like, how do you make that into some really small chunk that you can test out? We talked about the feeding learning back into the process. The other point that's really important, and I think we don't do very much of in education, is actually this connect to the user experiences and needs. So usually whoever is designing the learning has not actually asked the users what is they need. You know, and this is a big principle from design thinking, that depending on where it looks like the most energy and interest is in this group, we can do more with in January. But this notion of empathy and of really trying to hear what is it that people need, and then are we providing that? That's a fundamental principle in rapid learning cycles. Another example that's more directly tested out in education is what is from the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, and is what they call improvement science. So this is Tony Bright, who used to be in Chicago, and colleagues. And they basically describe 6 core principles of improvement. And you'll hear some common themes here. These are directly quoted from their website, which is at the bottom here. And they also have a new book that talks about these more. It's called Learning to Improve: How America's Schools Can Get Better at Getting Better. Their whole thing is, how do you get better at getting better? So they say, well, first you have to make the work problem specific, which we've talked about, and user centered. The second, they have like more text under all these, but I thought it would be an unreadable PowerPoint slide. But I left this second one, the subtext, just because I thought it was really important. So they say variation in performance is the core problem to address. So in the education world, that is, you know, that it matters more which classroom kids are in than anything else in terms of the experience they have when they go to school. So they said the critical issue is not what works, but rather what works for whom and under what conditions. So it's a different way of thinking about scale. And the idea here is we have to get really clear about how context matters and not let us off the hook for like there being common principles, but we really have to dig in and understand what works for whom under what conditions. They say you have to actually understand, how does the system produce the current outcomes that you've got. Systems are really good at perpetuating whatever outcomes they're currently producing. So if you want to overturn those or change those, you have to understand that. That's what the 5 whys helps you do. We cannot improve at scale what we cannot measure. So some of you talked about this earlier. Like, part of the problem is we don't always know how to measure whether we're having success, and that makes it really hard to improve. That doesn't mean you have to use test scores, but you have to have some way of knowing how are we improving on what we care about. Number 5 is common across all learning cycles of all kinds, which is that there's disciplined inquiry. There's a real discipline to it. There's sets of protocols and tools. There are steps. You go through a set process. And then the 6th one is more unique to their particular approach, which is that you can accelerate improvement through networked communities. And their idea is basically that you get a community that's networked across sites, so not all from one context, and they have a common problem of practice that they choose to work on together very actively. You can find out more about how they do this on their website if you want. I'm sharing this example with you because I thought the way they go about this might be really helpful to you in Vermont. So that's an idea. More the point here, though, is that you can see whether it's from like lean startup mode or whether it's from, hey, we're trying to help educators do their work better. There are lots of really, really common principles, most of which we don't do routinely in education. So that's a little bit of those. So here's my distillation of 3 top tips related to these things. And you've heard me say them all in various forms, but just to distill them for you. The first one is to think big, but act small. So one of the F words you nominated was focus. I think that's a huge one when it comes to improvement. And again, using the DataWise as an example, we found that when people went from saying we're working on math to we're working on fractions in the 4th grade, or we're working on reading to, you know, those readers' notebooks we use all the time? Like, let's see if we can make those better. What happened was it got things chunked enough that people could work on something. And then the teacher saw, wow, we actually made something better. The kids learned something. And that's hugely motivating to go after it and try something else. And you also have a lot more, we already talked about that. You have a lot more repetition. So one of your hypotheses before about why we get stuck on improvement is we don't actually let people practice enough. That's true about improvement too. So if you have a really big cycle with a really big focus that takes, we're going to do a 1-year inquiry on blah, 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 then people don't get enough practices on how to improve. So repetition helps, focus helps with that, and the tighter the circle, the faster the acceleration. And we already talked about this. The more you can normalize failure as part of learning, celebrate when something goes totally wrong, but you learn something really important, that can really, really help set a culture where people are more willing to fail a little bit in the spirit of succeeding hugely. So that's a few top tips. Let me